Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Batman vs. Aliens 2. Now, Batman vs. Aliens 2 is a graphic novel written by Ian Edginton and illustrated by Staz Johnson and published by DC and Dark Horse Comics. Now, this was first published as a 3-issue limited series in 2003, and then later on all 3 issues were collected into one graphic novel or trade paperback. Now, this features the character of Batman, originally created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, going up against the Xenomorphs, who are the villains from the Alien franchise, which started in 1979 with the sci-fi horror classic Alien, which was written by Dan O'Bannon and directed by Ridley Scott. Alien was followed by the sequel, Aliens, in 1986, which was directed by James Cameron, which many people consider to be superior to the original, but Aliens spawned an ongoing comic book series from Dark Horse Comics, and eventually you got Aliens vs. Predator comics, and in 1995 there was a Superman and Aliens crossover from Dan Jurgens. Then you got a Batman and Aliens crossover in 1997, which was written by Marz and illustrated by Wrightson, which this comic is a sequel to. Now, I've already reviewed the first Batman vs. Aliens comic back in 2017, and I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can check out that review. Now, of course, I'm doing this review as part of my yearly series of Batman reviews, and I actually did review this back in 2013 when I first started doing these Batman reviews, because I actually read this long before I read the first one. But I took my old review of this comic down, and I wanted to redo it because of all the crossovers between the Aliens franchise and the DC Universe, this is actually my favorite. Now, this does reference the events of the first Batman vs. Aliens comic, but to be honest, you can easily read this without having to read the first one. Now, I have a lot of nostalgia for this comic. My uncle actually got this for me when I'm pretty sure I was 11 when he got this for me. I forgot whether it was for Christmas or Easter or something. I know it wasn't for my birthday, but he got this for me when I was very young, and I grew up on Batman, and I also grew up on the Alien franchise. Alien was one of the first horror franchises I ever saw as a little kid, and yes, I know I was probably way too young to be watching those movies, but I'm glad I saw those movies at such a young age. So, this comic is actually very near and dear to me, and I'm not going to claim it's one of the most well-written Batman stories out there, but it's one of my personal favorites just because of that nostalgia factor. Now, the plot of Batman vs. Aliens 2 is it begins where this construction crew uncovers this underground fortress, and they bust in there and find this old laboratory that's been down there since the early part of the 20th century. And they end up releasing a xenomorph that's been living down there for the past 70 years, and this xenomorph brutally kills these construction workers. So Batman and Jim Gordon start investigating into this, and at first they think this was some kind of a hit because the owner of this construction company was involved with the mob. But soon Batman, who in this continuity has dealt with the xenomorphs before, realizes what they're up against and realizes that they're in big trouble if this thing ends up reproducing. And eventually some homeless people end up getting impregnated with baby aliens, so Batman and Jim Gordon have to race against time to stop these things before they take over Gotham City. And eventually a military scientist named Dr. Fortune comes in to deal with this threat, and right off the bat, no pun intended, Batman does not trust her at all, and soon it becomes apparent that Dr. Fortune has an agenda all her own. Now, in the story, you find out how these xenomorphs got to Gotham City. You find out that in the 1920s, there was a professor who went on an expedition to Antarctica, believing that he could find the origin of man there, and there him and his students found this crashed alien spaceship, and they found the xenomorphs, and this professor went crazy and brought some of the alien eggs back with him to Gotham City, and he ended up impregnating himself with them, and sealed himself up inside this lab until these construction workers eventually freed the xenomorph that was born out of him. But this aspect of the story actually reminded me a lot of the H.P. Lovecraft novella At the Mountains of Madness, and it wouldn't surprise me if Ian Edginton maybe got some inspiration from that story, because Lovecraftian themes have always been present in the Alien franchise, and actually that story, At the Mountains of Madness, seems to have had a pretty big impact on the Alien series. This comic also has some elements of Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, because the villain, Dr. Fortune, is a very Frankenstein-esque character where, in the story, she actually does play God by combining alien and human DNA, creating alien and human hybrids. Now, something that always struck me about this comic, even as a little kid when I first read it, is just how gory and brutal it is. Like, in the beginning, the construction workers are literally bisected by the alien. And then later on, the aliens attack Arkham Asylum, and you see people with their faces torn off. Like, if this were a movie, this would be a hard R. So even though I was a little kid when my uncle got me this comic, this is definitely not a comic for kids. Also, in the scene that takes place at Arkham, Two-Face, my favorite Batman villain, shows up, and he's freaking badass in the scene that he shows up in, and I honestly wish the comic used him a little bit more. But later on you find out that Dr. Fortune has created alien clones of some of Batman's greatest adversaries. So you get an alien clone of Harvey Dent, an alien clone of Poison Ivy, an alien clone of Scarecrow, an alien clone of Mr. Freeze, and an alien clone of Joker. You also have a Killer Croc alien show up at the end of the comic. And while it might be a little cheesy to have alien versions of Batman's greatest enemies, for this comic, I thought it worked. My only complaint about these hybrids between the xenomorphs and Batman's villains is Batman actually dispatches of them pretty quickly in the comic. It also doesn't make a whole lot of sense why the Harvey Dent alien would actually have a scar on his face, because that wouldn't transfer genetically, unless you maybe want to assume that this alien knows about his human counterpart and maybe intentionally scarred his face to sort of pay tribute to his human counterpart. It also doesn't make a whole lot of sense why the Jonathan Crane alien actually looks like a giant scarecrow, although the Jonathan Crane alien also looks a lot like the newborn from Alien Resurrection, which is probably what they were paying tribute to, because you could tell Alien Resurrection had a huge influence on this comic. And Dr. Fortune is actually a pretty interesting antagonist, and you find out that the reason she's doing this is because she's part of a group of people who do not trust superheroes at all, and are actually fearful that one day superheroes might turn against us, and you get the idea that she's creating these alien and human hybrids as a way to prepare for some kind of war with the superheroes. But you also find out that she does have a very special connection with the xenomorphs, which I won't give away in case you haven't read the comic. And Staz Johnson's artwork in this is actually really well done, and I particularly liked the way he drew the xenomorphs, especially the first xenomorph that we see in the story that is, like, all gray. I think because it's older, because it's been living underground for 70 years. Or maybe it's meant to be albino because it was born underground. But the gray xenomorph is actually really interesting visually. But yeah, I enjoy Batman vs. Aliens 2 quite a bit, and if you can get your hands on this, I definitely recommend it. But that was my review on Batman vs. Aliens 2, and bye.